our lives are stories, they tell us who we are. But me, my friends, my family, those we love and love no more. Live our lives as stories, not always knowing why, but the world keeps turning.
Welcome to One Loud Voice, an initiative of the Australian Children's Laureate Foundation. My name is Laurine Croasdale, and I'm joined here by Lindy Batchelor, who's also a fellow board member of the foundation. We're zooming in today from Belrose Library on the Northern Beaches in Sydney, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, and they are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank Robin Ewing and Joe Padgham, the Literature Symposium, for this invaluable initiative. So a little bit about us. The Australian Children's Laureate Foundation is a national not-for-profit organisation, and our vision is to enrich the lives of young people through the power of story and imagination. And our primary activity is the development and management of the Children's Laureate program. The laureate is appointed every 2 years and must be an Australian author or illustrator who's made a significant contribution to the development of literature in this country. They're a national and international ambassador for Australian children's literature, and they speak on behalf of creators and the children's book industry. During their term, the laureate visits every state and territory to promote the transformational power of reading, creativity and imagination in the lives of developing readers. The foundation also creates free activities and resources for children, young adults, teachers, librarians and parents. We also like to interact with the children's literature industry to talk about common concerns around reading and story, and Lindy is going to speak a little bit about One Loud Voice.
Maybe that's why our laureates look so tired sometimes, Laurine, and why we feel a little tired as volunteer board members. But on the 11th of May this year, we organised what has become our third Australian Children's Laureate Summit. It was a roundtable discussion at the Chow Chak Wing Museum at the University of Sydney. There are 25 people who work in the children's literature space, including authors, illustrators, our previous laureate, Ursula Dubasarski, academics, booksellers, publishers, librarians and teachers were all present that day. There were lots of great ideas discussed, and we thought we'd really like, in this year's symposium from the foundation, to run through the questions and some of the responses and key findings that came out of that day so we can report them all to the broader children's literature industry. Originally, One Loud Voice was created at the first Laureate Summit we held in 2019 when Morris Gleitzman was our laureate, and that summit was attended by the 5 existing laureates at the time. And then the One Loud Voice concept was raised again in February 2021 when we held the second Laureate Summit at Somerset Story Fest on the Gold Coast. A universal message that came out of these 2 summits was how can we all work together better? We all share similar goals and messaging, but together we all feel we could be one loud voice with more power and more skills to galvanise our industry so we can work together in an even more supportive and collaborative way. So we posed 3 questions on the day at the Chow Chak Wing Museum, in that beautiful museum on the grounds of Sydney University, and we were very pleased to be hosted by them in the day. We gave people these questions to consider ahead of the discussion. These were the ways we could create more awareness about children's books, authors and illustrators, the issue about diversity in children's books, and how we can all work together more in this one loud voice capacity to get these messages heard more widely in the broader community. And Laurine's going to tell us now about some of the key findings from that group that were raised on the day.
So we started with one question. Our first question was, how can we generate more buzz around Australian children's books, including authors and illustrators? And how can we collectively embed a stronger reading culture? So some of the comments that came from that question were that we should be putting the young person's voice more into the conversation. We could perhaps create a grass culture in schools and encourage children to share more books online and encourage conversations around those stories. Put your young readers into the heart of the conversation, and other children will be more open to listening to the points of view of their peers. Another comment that came through is the emphasis should be on fun.
Oh, I agree with that.
Yes, and I wholeheartedly agree too. Our approach should be really on fostering imagination, play and creativity, and embrace all the ways in which stories can be shared. So we get children reading for fun, and then they'll start to develop and show more interest in wider reading from there. Another comment was that we need to work more closely with teacher librarians, and most of the authors and illustrators that you'll speak to will cite a teacher librarian who initiated their lifelong love of reading and developed into a career.
We've got an amazing group of dedicated booksellers around the country, and we at the Foundation often want to work more closely with these booksellers, but we all know how busy they are, and it was commented on the day that it would be good because booksellers have existing relationships already with schools and teacher librarians and have a great influence over what books are chosen. A blind spot was talked about was multilingualism, that 1 in 4 children in Australia come from a background where English is a second language, so there's that diversity issue being raised early on in the discussions that day.
One of the other key comments was that 1 in 6 children in Australia are currently living in poverty, and part of this problem is that parents are unable to access libraries in remote areas, and they're also unaware about how much reading fiction can help develop compassion, understanding and life skills. So we perhaps need to think a little bit more about parents and caregivers and how we can support those. And there are some comments on further on about suggestions on how we could do that.
Lots of these relationships and ways to encourage people to be more involved in reading have been summarised every couple of years. The Foundation produces a biennial report about the Laureate's term. So we had one recently about Morris's term, and then this was published just before Gabrielle began as Laureate about Ursula's term, and the number of organisations that we've worked with throughout those years is really heartwarming to us that we can do so much together. Even though our Laureate is unfunded, I'm sure people will be surprised to know this, but we only have funding for 14 days a year for the Laureate to travel to each state and territory in their 2-year term. So as many of our fellow organisations experience, funding really is an issue for children's literature programs. We went on to the second question then, which was framed in how do we make it easier for children to see themselves in stories? And we focused in this session about diversity. And the idea about wanting to discuss diversity in children's books were one of the suggestions from the first summit, because we all recognise support and advocate for diversity in children's books, and minority languages is a big new theme. There are over 300 different languages spoken in Australian homes. So that's a huge amount of children who aren't able to access and easily use books written in English. But there are many types of diversity, not just cultural diversity that we identified on the day. There are issues, of course, since COVID, especially with mental health issues. There's a large number of ADHD and dyslexic children now being identified that previously didn't seem to be so much. We work with the Deafness Foundation for hearing impaired children, children who have learning difficulties, blind students, people with disability and neurodiversity in many aspects of learning, as well as First Nations people. We talked about the concept of windows, mirrors and sliding doors, and I wonder if any of you have heard this expression. It was a new expression to me until recently, raised by one of the members of our staff. But it talks about the analogy about the importance of diversity in books and the authors who write them. We need books when children can see themselves and reflections of themselves, but also look through a window to see other worlds. I think it's a great concept. So you just don't see the world outside. They can also see their own reflection in these stories. The window is a mirror. The book shows you the world, but it also shows you a different reflection of yourself.
So one of the key findings was that the Australian education system currently focuses on English literacy, and there is a big blind spot for children who use English as a second language. There's also all the teaching is in English, and children often want to come to school and use their mother tongue, which they're currently not able to do. So there is a call for schools to create a bridge that might be more helpful for children in this situation. Another comment that some educators have found to be really profoundly helpful in schools is by putting creatives in schools and giving students an opportunity to see themselves as storytellers and writers. So if children are able to put their own words down and write about their own lives and their community, it's not only empowering, but it's building self-confidence, and it's a really key factor for those children.
We see that a lot, don't we? Oh, sorry, I interrupted you. We see that a lot when the Laureate goes to visit schools, so the difference that it makes to those kids, and when authors and illustrators go into school, so they can actually understand there is an author and they're a very ordinary person in those situations, and they can be a creative person themselves.
And I think that was one thing that Gabrielle, our current laureate, found, that a lot of children came up to her and said that they felt almost ashamed because they were Asian, and it was so important for them to be able to go to school and see somebody who looks exactly like them write stories about things that are interesting to their culture or to the culture they've grown up with, and also to see that this person has come from a background of having struggles with reading and writing, but still managing to persevere and overcome those. So it's been a very rewarding experience.
And not just in those diversities, but in the First Nations people too. That was a comment on the day.
Yeah, so First Nations, there were a number of First Nations comments that were made. I'll get to those in a second, though. Another comment that was made is that there isn't a great deal of interest in publishing, or from publishers. It's currently considered very white and doesn't really represent all the children in Australia. And that there is this wonderful commercial opportunity for multilingual children's literature if publishers would like to step out of the box and start looking at ways in which they can reach this enormous market that's out there of children wanting to read in different languages. There's a lot of literature that we don't see as well. There are translations of stories that can be found overseas, but currently it's very difficult to find those stories in translation in Australia. So there is an opportunity there to try and build up that area as well. One of the First Nations people in our group had a number of comments to make about their experience, their personal experience growing up in Australia. And she said that she never saw herself reflected in stories, and that she lived in a space where she wasn't part of the narrative, that she had nothing in common with white Australia, and her experiences weren't like the rest of Australia, and yet she was unable to ever find herself in a story. Now she publishes stories which to varying degrees are considered not normal, but for her they are normal because they're about her background and culture and common aspects in the community. So one of the blocks for creating or publishing stories in other languages is the Australian standing orders, who often make an order for a book to increase their print run and make it possible for that publisher to publish that book, will only take books or stories if they're in English and not in First Nations language, for example. So that makes it very difficult for a publisher trying to get that funding out or get that print run bulked up a little bit so that they can really get those stories out there. So the key, I think, for this person making comments is about publishing stories with humour and in language, and truth-telling and genuinely investigating our history. It was mentioned that Magabala Books has defined what it means for Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders to be literate and to also focus on different types of intelligence, which is something that I think is currently not really being recognised.
Magabala Books is just doing wonderful publishing. They have for many years, but certainly over the last few years, the number of books coming out of Magabala with First Nation stories is really heartening. And Alison Lester, our previous laureate, does a lot of work with the Indigenous Literacy Foundation and with Magabala Books in creating wonderful new stories. The ACLF has put a big focus on diversity during Gabrielle Wong's term as laureate, and being able for children to see themselves in stories. We've got Gabrielle's poster up on the wall behind us, and she took the theme of imagine a story. She wanted children to be able to imagine themselves in stories. Buri Monty Pry was our First Nations laureate in 2012 with Alison Lester, and we've also been able to promote diversity of audio books through Belinda Audio this year on our website. Thanks to Laurine's fun relationship and organising with Belinda Books has been a lovely monthly initiative. And the Deafness Foundation, we work hard to help include hearing impaired children in our programs, and we have Auslan translations of stories on our website, and Auslan translators we try to use when we can at larger events.
So our third and final question was, how can we work together to support one another in our common but varied aims? Where do we go to from here? The symposium came up immediately because it's just such a great example of all different organisations meeting together to work together as one and see what we can achieve. And already I think there are 14 organisations involved, and the success has been enormous, and that's hats off to Robin and Joe. There are also a lot of materials that are available free of charge that could be given to teachers or trainee teachers, or used as lesson plans in schools. There are professional development sessions. There are lots of different activities that can be downloaded from websites, and they can be found on our website, but also through PETA, Reading Australia, and the National Centre for Australian Children's Literature. There are also booksellers who are putting together great book lists and sending those out to schools. So there is a huge amount of interest and material there. And if people are keen to access that, let us know, because then we can put together a list of resources, and maybe everyone in the symposium might be willing to publish that on their websites, so it's easy for a number of people to access. So One Loud Voice, we feel, could be a bit of a hub where everyone can contribute, and we can start putting stories out to media. We can promote children's books, we can promote children's authors and illustrators, and really start to get the voice out there. It's just not present in media at all, and I think that's because we're not rattling the cage enough.
We're too polite and well-managed.
Another thing that we could do more of is having writers in residence or writers' workshops and community sessions so that school children can be involved in those. They could happen through the school, or they could happen through libraries, but that will probably be something that we would need to source government funding for, and something that we as a group could probably collectively put something together and approach the minister. One comment that really interested me is that during lockdown last year, a lot of young people, there was research done afterwards, and a lot of young people said that they love belonging and being part of the community. And this has sort of broken down a bit since lockdown stopped, and it might be worth bringing that back, or going back to creating communities and neighbourhoods or drop-in centres. I know Lost in Books has a drop-in centre, and I think Big Sky Stories in Broken Hill also has encourages a drop-in centre, or drop-in activities, so that it just brings more people together in communities, and particularly in somewhere that is remote or regional, where they don't have the same access and knowledge to promote stories and authors, and something that perhaps we could take more of a stronger role in and help them promoting that information.
I really enjoyed the recent edition of the symposium where Big Sky Stories, the girls were speaking about the work they do with that program, and they were amazing what they're working on and doing together out there in the remote communities. And the Australian Publishers Association is also coordinating with ALIA, with the Australian Society of Authors and Book People, under the Australia Reads and Books Create banner, to directly lobby the key decision makers in government. And we've certainly tried to speak to government over the years, and we have very lovely conversations with them, but nothing seems to eventuate. So I think that will help if we can all have a stronger message that's well designed and marketed, and we could all pledge some time and staff resources to get behind approaches to ministers, the same as that national cultural policy has been so successful in creating this new direction with children's literature, hopefully. And the appointment of a poet laureate was very appealing to us, because obviously the government understands what the word laureate means.
And they can see the value of that role.
Yeah. In fact, they had a Parliamentary Friends of Australian Children's Storytelling has just been re-established in Parliament, and in May they held a meeting and an evening where they were raising awareness about children's writing books in that big White House in Canberra. So we'd like to think that more of that can take place too. And the Laureate Foundation is also part of, I'm not sure whether many of you listening would be aware, we're part of an international laureate network. There are 12 laureates, or reading ambassadors as they're called in some countries, around the world now. And every 2 years, as many of those laureate organisations meet together at the Bologna Children's Book Fair. And I had the pleasure of going there in 2019 when Morris Gleitzman was the laureate, and again this year in 2023 with Gabrielle and with our program manager, Chris, to go to the Bologna Children's Book Fair and attend this International Laureate Summit. And we actually, the Australian branch of that international group, produced this book, Read Around the World, that shows you and gives you information about all the different laureates and reading ambassadors. Oh, I keep going the wrong way on the screen. Reading ambassadors around the world. So we've got booklets like that if anybody would like to have a look at those. And the key message that came out of our International Laureate Summit this year was the importance of recognising, supporting and advocating for diversity in children's books. And a number of the laureates are actually laureates who speak in minority languages, in Ireland and the Netherlands, for instance. So that's that cultural diversity continuing on as well. And just for a little bit of controversy for us to end on, I'd like to just tell you the Children's Books Ireland Laureate organisation is very active and helps to coordinate all the international laureates. And a few years ago, they changed their structure in Ireland, which I think is certainly worth us having a think about, where they've got under the Children's Books Ireland umbrella, they've got a number of children's literature organisations. They've got a book gifting programs, and we've got lots of gifting organisations in Australia who are keen to get books into the hands of children. They run book clinics where they appoint book doctors who go out and talk to children through the Irish communities. They publish, like we used to have Reading Time as a magazine, but they publish still a magazine that reviews books, their Innes magazine, and creates guided reading lists for kids. They support artists as often as they can by having as many authors and illustrators in schools and in the communities. And the Laureate program falls under Children's Books Ireland as just one of their spokes in their umbrella. And they also run the annual Children's Books Ireland Award, like our Book of the Year Award, the KPMG Children's Book Ireland Award, and they run an annual conference about children's books every year in September. So controversially, you look at the way all those organisations in Ireland are joined together, and can we pose the questions, should we or could we look at working together in a similar and different way? We thank all of you for joining the symposium today. We appreciate your support of the Laureate program and the work of the voluntary board at the Children's Literature Foundation. We admire, respect and applaud everyone's work and your passion for children's literature, books, reading. And we also, separately, we are lots of small, busy, slightly stressed perhaps, passionate supporters of the Australian children's book industry. We're all doing our best, but together we believe that we can be one loud voice, and therefore we're all going to be harder to ignore.
So as you can see, there's no simple solution or one answer to the things that we've been talking about. But we do feel strongly that if we keep sharing and breaking down silos and connecting with each other and empowering children and young adults to become involved, we should be able to bring about change. So if you'd like to join One Loud Voice, or you'd like a list of free resources that might be helpful to you, just contact us on the email address that's showing on the slide, and we will be in touch with you.
And good ideas are always welcome. We love to hear about your ideas and thoughts, so let's share them all together and see how we can move forward together.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening.
See ya.
Bye. Read on.
All our lives are stories. They tell us who we are. But me, my friends, my family, those we love and love no more. Live our lives as stories, not always knowing why, but the